Good evening, everybody, and welcome to part 4 of our Washington Leadership Program. My name is Colby Kyo. I'm one of the co-chairs on CAPAL's Board of Directors. We're very proud at CAPAL to be continuing to build a public service pipeline for Asian American, Pacific Islander, and Native Hawaiian youth. Today's session, part 4 of our series, is all about Pacific Islander indigeneity and the environment. We're going to be talking about issues impacting Pacific Islanders, the impacts of tourism, and I think particularly going to be interesting, the intersection of identity and environment. We're so pleased to be here at the AT&T Forum. Thank you to our supporters and sponsors and friends at AT&T. Also want to thank the Mayor's Office of Asian Pacific Islander Affairs, MOAPIA, to Comcast, and to Bonafide for continuing to support our program. We're very proud to offer this program free and open to the public. This is part 4. There are 2 more sessions in our series this summer. This program is designed to provide a meaningful professional experience to scholars and interns of our program, but also to AA and HPIs in DC and nationwide. So we have a lot of people joining us online today as well. So hello to you all. Tonight's panel, I'm very honored to be introducing our moderator tonight, Meeyoung, who's going to be taking us through. Thank you to our panelists for joining us. Some fresh off a flight. Angelo, I think, is correct. All right. Fresh. But thank you to our staff as well, I think, for pulling together a really fantastic program. This is our first series back in person after a few years pause. And we couldn't be more thankful to be back with you. So thank you all for attending today. There is a survey that's very important that you all fill out. We need 80% participation, but let's make that 100. So when Hannah comes up here and talks about the survey, I want you to take her very seriously. And we have some CAPAL interns who will knock your heads if you don't fill it out before you leave, okay? With that, cheery note, let's toss over to Meeyoung and our panel.
Test. My voice can be very light. Kasalelia, Lainwo, Rananim, Mokatin, Hafaday, Bulafinaka, and warmest greetings to each one of you who are here tonight, that are here in person and virtually. Welcome to the 2023 Washington Leadership Program, Session 4, Pacific Islander Indigeneity and the Environment. We have 4 panelists today: Angelo, Villagomez from CNMI. And our next panelist is Esther Wozniak from Fiji. Hula. Our third panelist today is Laakea Stone from Hawaii. And the last panelist is Lauren Swaddell from Guam. I would like to take this moment now to ask each one of them to introduce themselves and share the work that they do for environment. Let's start with Laakea.
Cool, awesome. Hi, aloha kako. Laakea keia, no kumapuni o na iko ohana. My name is Laakea. My family is from the island of Lanai on the island chain of Hawaii. I was born and raised in Hawaii. I was born on Oahu. And then I was raised in Hilo, which is on the Big Island. I moved to DC in 2019, and I currently work in Senator Mazie Hirono's DC office. I am her legislative correspondent for the Energy and Environment team, which includes agriculture, public lands, environmental issues, water infrastructure, and also Native issues. In addition to that, I am also her Appropriations coordinator. And I'm going to stop there. Ladies first.
Okay. Bulavinaka, everybody. My name is Esther Wozniak. I'm with Pew's International Fisheries team. Been there for a few years now, 7-ish. I was born and raised in Fiji. I studied marine science at the University of the South Pacific, and then moved to the States, and I've now been working at Pew for a while. I initially started on our global shark conservation team, which Angelo was a part of at one point, and that's now merged into our international fisheries team. And so a lot of our work is focused at the regional fisheries management organizations, or RFMOs, as we call them. And over there, we work on a bunch of different ocean of fisheries management things, such as harvest strategies. We work on ending illegal fishing and a bunch of conservation management measures for things like bycatch in fisheries. So that includes sharks, turtles, seabirds, all the cool stuff. Yeah.
Thank you. Next. Can you hear me like this? Okay. Marasan Hafade, Guahusi Lawrence Swaddell, Familian Fallen, Tau Tau Guahan. So hello, my name's Lawrence Swaddell. My family is the Merfallen clan in Guam, and I'm from Guam. I moved to DC for the second time last year to work for Pew Charitable Trust to support their international ocean conservation portfolio. So that makes me feel real fancy, because before I was doing my field research, like in the jungle, collecting native plants to work on watershed restoration and like community engagement. So I feel like I've gone back and forth between Guam and the East Coast, learning things from each of my experiences and trying to bring that experience with me wherever I go. My favorite things to work on right now are marine protected areas, big international events. And I'm just curious, how many of you here are already in the environmental field or studying things related to the environment? 1, 2, 3. Okay, cool. Just curious.
Hey, so I'm Angelo Villagomez. I've known Esther and Lauren for a number of years, and I've learned it's just best to let them have the first word and the last word. So I wanted to let them introduce themselves first. I'm from an island called Saipan in the Western Pacific. My parents actually met here in Washington, D.C. My dad was on a Native American scholarship at Catholic University, and my mom was across the street at Trinity. I don't know if any of you go to those schools. Maybe not. Okay, never mind. Thought I'd give a shout out, but it failed. I guess I'll just start and say there are actually 3 people on this stage are Pacific Islanders who work in ocean conservation in Washington, D.C. And in total, there's only 6 of us. So if anything happens to this room, we're going to lose half of the Pacific Islanders who are influencing national and international policy on ocean conservation in Washington, D.C. But I've been an ocean advocate for about 20 years and identified as a Pacific Islander. And when I was coming up in conservation, I was just kind of happy to have my foot in the door. And 10 years ago, I feel like we didn't have conversations like this. So I'm just very thankful for the hosts to create this space. And I look out in this room and I see there's a Chamorro sitting over there. We may have even had like the same tattoo artist. I'm just looking at your arm and I'm looking at my arm, like, man, those look kind of similar. We can talk about that later. But I'm just really excited to be here, and I want to thank all of you for coming to spend some time with us today.
Thank you all for the very informative introduction. So my first question to each one of you would be, what first drew you to work in the areas and issues surrounding the environment? Can you share the kind of work you focus on in your current job and community? Let's start from my left, Laakea.
Oh, sure. I think I can attribute one day in a particular year to being the first domino for why I am here in DC. And that is October 7th, 2014. The day there were the groundbreaking ceremony for the TMT telescope on Mauna Kea in Hawaii. I was in my undergrad and I went up to the mountain. Mauna Kea is located on the Big Island of Hawaii, which is where I'm from. And I grew up looking and revering that mountain. And I went up there and I remember protesting, being activated, saying, why are they desecrating our sacred spaces? Saying, who's responsible for these things? Wondering what could I do about it? Wondering out loud, what was it, the reason, how were they able to do that? I heard someone, you know, I can't identify them, but I heard someone say the environmental policy, you know, something about that, the permitting. And I said, policy, what is that, you know? And so I'd attribute that moment, that day, to being the first domino that fell. I then am a information seeker. So I started doing my own research. I started finding resources. I started learning more about the government process through my own means. And I also was activated in 2016, activated again in 2018. And I actually did have a crisis in my, like an identity crisis after I graduated. I didn't know what to do. And this might bleed on to to other questions, but I had a degree and I had no job and I was homeless because of Hurricane Lane that came and wiped out some of my side of the island. And I was like, what am I gonna do? And then my friend sent me an internship opportunity in DC. And I was like, oh, let's go check it out in DC. And that was supposed to be a 3-month internship in 2019. And I'm still here in 2023, you know? So I'd say that is kind of the gist of why I'm doing what I'm doing. I'm grateful that I can pinpoint, you know, a specific point in time in which I can attribute the rest of my career, my life, and still learning from that moment. I never went to school for public policy. I was a linguistics major. It took me 7 years to get a BA. I worked through it, and I worked all through my college, and I paid my own rent. And since I was 17, I just still learning from that moment, you know? So yeah, I'm gonna stop there. Oh.
Me? Yeah, so I guess for me, it was kind of like the combining of two ideas. One was I really wanted to be a scientist. But the other one was I was an activist. And you know, if you know about science, like those are kind of in conflict. So I was in school and I started with physics and I was really, really bad at it because it was mostly math. I was like, when do we get to the rockets? And it was just mostly math. And so I switched to chemistry, and like chemistry wasn't great. So then I did biology and I took a tropical ecology course. And that's when sort of like my activist and my scientist personality kind of like crashed and came into one. And it was just this realization that, you know, like at the time I was like, oh, I'm going to study beetles and I'm going to go down to the rainforest and I'm going to like name beetles. But this idea that like a multinational corporation could come in, cut down your life's work overnight, and then like now there's no more beetles for you to count. And you know, I'm like 20, 21 at this time, like, oh, that's terrible. I'm going to dedicate my life to saving the rainforest. But I got some of these messages from my dad as well. I remember even before I went to college, being on Saipan, and we were out one day fishing, and we were on the north end of the island, and there was this place where they were building a new hotel, and the hotel had just bulldozed through these limestone rocks that had been there for like, you know, thousands and thousands of years, and put a nice real path so the tourists would have like a nice easy way to get from the hotel down to the beach. And like, I'm 17. And I'm like, I'm just angry. I'm like, why would they let you do this? And my dad was like, well, son, for now, all you can do is go off to college, get your degree, get smart, and then come back and make sure that never happens again. And like, I think about that a lot.
Esther?
Oh, I don't know if I have a specific date. I think that's really cool, yeah, that you have that. That's a cool journey. So yeah, growing up in Fiji, you're pretty much surrounded by the ocean. You're very much drawn to it from a young age. I say you, I was very much drawn to it from a young age. We at one point was living on the ocean. We had a little houseboat. And so I always knew it was something I wanted to do. It was very clear from the get-go. When I went to the University of the South Pacific and studied marine science, they did lay out, you could do research, you could do advocacy, you could do like policy. And I figured I wanted to do a combination of all of that, but also fisheries management. And the reason I was interested in that is because my dad, my brothers, uncles, cousins, they're all commercial albacore fishermen. And so this is very much like a source of livelihood for folks in my family. And that's important. And I wanted to make sure that hopefully they'll be able to do this for a while. And it was also important to me to make sure that that we didn't have this like us versus them kind of mentality, those who use the resources and those that conserve it, because I feel like there's very much an alignment there. And so I thought it was important to get into that space and do that. And when I moved to the States, and I saw that opening with Pew for global shark conservation, that very much struck my heart. I grew up listening to stories about Dakwanga, the shark god in Fiji. I have Mbu Monica, my one aunt, who would tell me all these stories. And so when I joined the global shark conservation team, they were actually working in the Pacific on this bunch of like shark sanctuaries, and we're working on CITES, the Convention for International Trade in Endangered Species. So being able to work on sharks and then go home and tell my grandmother about it was really special. And then also being able to work on fisheries and then go home and talk to my brother and uncles and still my grandmother about it. My grandmother only went to 3rd grade, and she only speaks Fijian. And I grew up with her, and Fijian's my first language. So being able to go back home and talk about some of the stuff that we're doing here, I thought has been really special. And the fisheries and the sharks angle very much brings it all full circle. And so I really like what we do.
I feel like I have a very similar story with Laakea and Angelo, where like there's this like tie of like activism and like needing to protect our natural resources. So I grew up in Guam. Like I'm 33 years old, so I graduated high school in 2007. Like we had MySpace. I was one of the first people on Guam with Facebook because my friend was in California and her high school was allowed to have Facebook. So she pretended that I was in her high school so I could get Facebook. We did not have social media. So growing up on Guam, which is a really small island, seemed so boring, right? And I just watched TV all the time and movies. I was like, I'm going to move to New York and be a forensic psychologist because I watched like a lot of Law and Order, like maybe too much Law and Order. And then I was in New York and I was like, wow, I love this place. But, I would ask questions like, oh, so do you guys swim in the Hudson River? No. How about the East River? Are you kidding me? No. And I would just ask all these questions about what I didn't realize. I was asking questions about how people there related to the environment. And I started noticing that trees was confined by concrete, and back home, my backyard was a jungle overflowing with life. I could swim in this beautiful Pacific Ocean protected by a coral reef, which is under threat because of climate change. And also something that happened in 2007 was the approval of the US military buildup to transfer a Marine base to Guam. And the plan at the time was outrageous. It's still outrageous, but it was even more outrageous than it is right now. And that, coupled with being in New York, away from Guam, and seeing the world from a different perspective, really made me say, wow, like I want to go home and protect the environment and make sure it's okay. Because I see what happens when things just get built and there's pollution. And now, because of the military buildup, there's rapid development happening on Guam. So that just made me change my whole life. It's like, no more forensic psychology. I'm not going to be in law and order. I'm going to go back to Guam, get a degree in environmental science. And I surprised all my teachers. They thought I was like a wild child. And now I'm just wild for the environment. So that's how I got here.
Thank you all. As you can see here, we're all Native Pacific Islanders that are very, the environment is very sacred to our hearts. We try to protect the environment, the ocean. And I wanted to bring up this question to each one of us up here is going to target on colonialism, military buildups, the climate change, and tourism. So my next question would be, how do you see environmental developments such as climate change, colonialism, military buildups, and tourism impacting our communities, especially within our Pacific Islander community? So Laakea, could you share on the tourism side, since Hawaii is big on tourism?
Is it? Just joking. It is. I'm sure. I'm going to answer that question through the lens of my experiences. And I'll tie it back to the first question, the first answer I had, which was when I was talking about having a degree but not being able to get a job. I actually did get a job, and I got a job at a restaurant at a hotel. That was the only job that I was able to get when I was working in my hometown on the island that I grew up on. I was trying to get other jobs, and I just didn't have the right experience that they were looking for. I had just come out of I just finished my undergraduate, so having professional experience is hard because you're in your undergraduate. But in order to have professional experience, you need a degree. So y'all know what that feels like. But yeah, so I was working in the tourism industry immediately before I moved to DC. It was very unfulfilling. As co-panelists mentioned, we all feel a connection to our land, and we all felt a need and a desire to either protect it or to raise awareness of the issues that our environment was facing. And I think that's because we all have that very specific connection. As Islander people, our land is very sacred to us. The word sacred is an interesting word because it invokes a certain connotation with English speakers and the West. Sacred meaning non-tangible. As Angelo was mentioning, sometimes it's at odds with the scientific community. In the school that I'm from in Hawaii, science and culture is not at odds. Our culture is science-based. Our nomenclature and our chants and our dances and our cultural traditional literature, it's nomenclature for natural phenomenon. And it's a guidebook for how to relate to our environment. The reason why we say our mountain is sacred and we shouldn't develop there, or we shouldn't have certain hotels or resorts built on certain shorelines, is because we can point to traditional literature saying that there is environmental phenomenon here that will be dangerous for us humans. For example, the Kilauea volcano on the east side of the Big Island. There was some development on the East Rift Zone in the Puna district, and housing development. And of course, it's a very high native population, right? That is housed there because it's cheap. And a lot of people can't, there isn't a lot of opportunity for the native peoples elsewhere. But the mountain, as mentioned in our stories, as our ancestors knew, the mountain of fire will explode and the lava will come. And there's nothing that we can do about that. So of course, some houses were taken. These are things that we Native people celebrate because as an island people, the mountain, the volcano creates land. And when you live in the biggest ocean on the planet, land is precious. So any kind of land creation is sacred to us. Sacred meaning important, sufficient, self-sufficient. So that's what I want to mention, that as a sense of that is science and culture is not at odds. But what is at odds with culture is capitalism, is the capitalism of tourism, the exploitation of the land, that the capitalist mentality will not listen to our ancestral literature. It will ignore it. It will dismiss it as a non-Western woo-woo. And so that's just my experience. I don't know if I answered the question, but hey, I spoke.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Esther, if you can cover on climate change.
Sure.
I think that would be a very good part to cover and share with our audience about climate change, how environment is.
I will try. It's a big topic. I think all of these are equally big, so I'm happy for my panelists to also jump in on that one. Climate change is tough, especially like coming from a Pacific island, knowing how big the problem is, how much it's impacting the Pacific Islands, and how little we've contributed to that problem. That just seems unfair right off the bat. But I'll touch on a few things. We know about sea level rise. There's this agreement between the Kiribati government and the Fijian government to repopulate a bunch of communities to Fiji. And I feel like that in itself is sad. The fact that the communities are going to lose their land and have to think about repopulating whole communities to another island in itself, that just doesn't seem right. And then another big impact that I have at least seen in my lifetime is the amount of Category 4 and 5 cyclones that have hit the Pacific. Talking from my experience in Fiji, it's been tough, to see just how impactful these cyclones have been, how frequent they've become, and then the floodings that come with that. My mom lives right by a river, right next to her sister's house, and that's family land, and it's known to flood every now and again. But in the last decade, it's flooded like 7 times. That's crazy, and so I think that's one of my main takeaways growing up from an island. Is you're either affected directly or someone who is affected directly. And it's not just because of the proximity of where you live, but because of the interconnectedness of like how tight knit the communities are. So for us, the problem with climate change is very real. It's very now. It's affecting people that we know on a daily basis. It's not, we don't have this luxury of it being an abstract thing that's, yes, we know it's bad. There's all these studies there, but we have a few years. No, it's right now. And so that presence of it just is very much felt, I know, in Fiji, but I'm sure in a lot of other Pacific Island countries. And then those are the top level stuff. When we think about climate change, we think about changing weather patterns, we think about sea level rise. But Pacific Islands are also affected in ways that maybe aren't top level. I'll reference this study that was published on nature.com recently that talked about how the tuna stocks are shifting from the Western Central Pacific Ocean to the east because of the changing in the warmth of the sea. And so what that means basically is a lot of these islands that very much rely on these tuna stocks for revenue, either through their own domestic fleets or from licensing fees that they get from distant water fishing fleets who come to fish in their exclusive economic zones, they're going to lose out on that. With the tuna leaving, that revenue is also leaving. So this is another way that climate change is affecting Pacific Islands that might not be top of mind, but is very much real and is very much impacting Pacific Islands on a day-to-day. But I feel like everyone here can probably add a little bit to that piece.
Yeah, I mean, the Pacific led a lot of the discussions at the international fora, like in 2015 during the Paris Agreement, when it was all falling apart. It was a small island developing states with, heroes like Tony DeBruym from the Marshall Islands, who worked with John Kerry in the United States to actually get to agreement for Paris. And, even if all the countries were to do the things that they committed to at Paris, like we'd still be kind of in deep shit. But it's the other thing that the islands are doing is leading some of the discussion around like loss and damage, because there's going to be a lot of problems. And so somebody's going to have to pay for these millions and billions of people to deal with the worst aspects of climate change, from flooding to fires. I mean, it's smoky in Washington, D.C. because there's fires in Canada. It's an outcome from climate change. At the last COP, I wasn't there, but this is the small island developing states led on the discussion for the loss and damage fund. And that's going to be incredibly important for like millions and billions of people to deal with these issues that are going to be popping up for the next hundreds of years.
Angelo, if you can tie the colonialism and military buildup.
Okay, I got the fun question.
And Saipan.
Yeah.
So,
So can I pull the audience real quick? Is anybody Thai or from Tongan? So we're, as an AAPI community, we all experience colonialism differently. You talked about we're all indigenous peoples, so yes, we identify as indigenous, but if you flip that coin, there's the existence of either a settler or a colonizer. And we're going to talk about the Pacific experience, but as the AAPI community, we should be talking about the history of colonialism and like the ongoing colonialism. Lauren talked about the military buildup on Guam. There was a new military base that opened up this year of our Lord 2023 that was built on stolen indigenous land. This is land that the United States just took after World War II. There were families on Guam who claimed to own that land. These are indigenous peoples. But the United States calls us the tip of the spear. That's a really scary idea. I mean, it's to live that close to areas where there could be war, and we have experienced war. I could tell you horror stories that my grandmother had to deal with during World War II. My aunts and my uncles were children at the time. Horror stories that you wouldn't even, I don't want to say in public, but that have lasting trauma for my family, for my cousins, my brothers and sisters. And when it comes to colonialism, it's really about it's a power dynamic. And the US Pacific territories are part of, but owned by the United States, right? So Lauren can't, we can vote for election. We live in Washington, DC. We still can't vote for president, but we're unrepresented in the Congress. But when you live in the territories, you don't get to vote for president. You don't have seats in the Senate, and you don't have voting representation in the House. Like what kind of government would you call that? That's a dictatorship. So like the territories exist as a form of dictatorship within the United States. I know that's very uncomfortable for most Americans to discuss. But we're talking about a power dynamic where the people millions of people, when this country was formed, there were only 2.5 million people living in the 13 colonies. There were 4 million people living in the colonies right now between Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands, Guam. So 4 million people who are unrepresented, where really important decisions are made on their behalf, and they're not able to participate in that. And one of those outcomes is the US military. And this, if you were to, actually, I realized I forgot to mention like who I worked for when I introduced myself, but I'm a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, and I've worked on marine protected areas and fishing for like the last 20 years. When I'm here in DC and I talk to people about what are the threats facing the ocean, they say it's climate change, they say it's fishing, it's introduced species and things like that. If you go to Guam and Saipan, you ask them what the threats are to the ocean, it's the military, the #1 threat. And I don't necessarily even have the solutions, but just being able to stand up and say, "Hey, we're here. We lived here. The bones of my ancestors are buried down the street. I would like to have more say in how my land is used." Is important for us to be. We're not there yet. We don't have the ability to do that. But we keep speaking up, and maybe someday we will listen. The United States is not the only country that has territories. France still has territories. Russia is trying to have more territories. If you see what's going on there, and colonialism leads to suffering. And just to bring it back to the AAPI community, all of our relatives have dealt with trauma. If you look back far enough, you've all got stories. You've got it's written in your DNA, the trauma from colonialism. And it's just a very uncomfortable conversation to have in polite places. But I do think it should be and could be a topic for our wider community, because that's how you heal.
Thank you for that. I wanted to share a piece that kind of ties with colonialism. How many of you here have heard of COFA, Compact of Free Association? If you can raise your hand. So only a few in here. So what is COFA? COFA is the Compact of Free Association, a special bilateral treaty between the United States and the freely associated state countries. And that includes Republic of Palau, Republic of the Marshall Islands, and Federated States of Micronesia, where I'm from. My elder peers always share ancestor stories. This is where you can find the chief of the ocean, which is master navigators. And we were once colonized by several countries and became former trust territory of the United States. After World War II, the 3 island countries declared their independence and became a sovereign nation. And the unique privilege that the COFA gave us was access to come freely into the US. And I think that's very important to specify that, especially at a national level, to people that we don't come here for a green card, because a lot of countries have used our areas. Colonialism is big back there, military buildups. As a COFA migrant coming here, we have the access to come here and study freely. Many of our citizens are enlisted in the US Armed Forces, and we have the highest per capita. Also, we come out here seeking healthcare because of climate change, the lack of healthcare back home. And on top of that too is job opportunities. So earlier they talked about how we survive off natural resources and climate change has affected, and especially with the COFA countries, natural disasters are happening. There was one that recently happened in Guam. Rising sea levels and cultural identities. One, our culture is fading because of colonialism and all that. And the list goes on and on and on that I can share about this, such as the livelihood of global food security. So out-migration and migration is real, and I am a product of it. So I wanted to share that because sometimes when it comes out from the locals or living in it, we connect to it. So I wanted to share that piece, and maybe later on I'll share how the COFA countries are very important to the United States. But my next question will be tying into Lauren, if you can share. Why is Pacific Islander representation important in the area of environmental work and research, especially having a Pacific Islander representation?
Thank
Can you share that?
Yeah, so I think it's so important for Pacific Islanders to be environmental leaders because there's like nowhere else on Earth where there's a group of people who knows the ocean so well. Our like Chamorros were on Guam and in the Marianas for people want to say it's 3,500 years, but I want to say it's 4,500 years because we have artifacts that say that. So my ancestors, not me, because I was never taught this because of colonialism. They knew what it meant when there's a certain bird that was over a certain place in the ocean. They knew what it meant when they saw a certain fish at a certain time because they relied on the ocean. They were like expert navigators. We had these magnificent, like deep sea canoes that just sailed all over. So like literally like we all came from like the same place, but like just at different times we broke off of the navigation sort of path. But now we're Micronesian, Melanesian, Polynesian, and we just have this like long-standing experience. Like when I left Guam, I had no idea that people didn't like love the ocean so much. I mean, there are people who do, but it was like innate in me, I think. And to come to the States and realize from a different lens and a different perspective, how important it is to preserve our Pacific Islander identity, roots, and traditional ecological knowledge is so important. And with things like climate change, forcing us to like leave our islands, you are now taking a source of knowledge for a specific place and moving it somewhere where it doesn't know how to place itself. You're taking away the knowledge holders of that area. And it removes identity. And then it's sort of disempowering, dehumanizing. But the empowering thing is to have more of us in spaces like this, in big international conferences, in the heart of the nation, advocating for what only we know and what we can protect, what is so important to us, and also being able to bridge the gap between the two, because there's still people in the Pacific Islands who, like if it's a US territory, some of them don't even speak English. But we have an English language-based system that is telling them what to do. So how can we empower our local communities to be able to advocate for themselves? We can't really do that if we just stay put. So that's why we need representation from our islands here. We need them in the international stage because we can tie those pieces together and hopefully transcend those boundaries and, keep communicating that and advocating for it. I felt like I rambled a little bit. I did good. Okay,
If I
thanks.
could add,
Yeah.
to that.
Yeah.
And it made me think, and you also, when you were talking about Micronesia, also made me think about the idea that I think we all share on this stage is the ocean is not something that separates us. It's an idea, and this is a very Western idea that like the ocean is a boundary in which separates. And that is not how our ancestors thought. That is not how an islander thinks. It is the ocean is something that connects us. We have and to mention the navigating, the way our ancestors traveled vast distances without anything to guide them except the stars, except for the birds, except for certain currents, except for certain winds, except for certain cloud formations. So our ancestors all understood this, and I think it's innate. The love for the ocean, is a thing because it connects us. In Olelo Hawaii, in Hawaiian language, we use the word moana nui akea, and it's a word that describes the vast ocean of enlightenment. Akea I interpret as so moana is ocean, nui is vast, akea I interpret as enlightenment. So that cultural knowledge, right, that Lauren was talking about the ocean is the teacher, the ocean is the connective tissue of our lineages to our ancestors, I just wanted to mention that. Sorry, thank you.
Thank you for that. I think that was very good for us to kind of connect with that. Back to Esther. Esther,
Switch it up.
what do we need for Pacific Islanders in leadership roles in ocean conservation and environment?
Yes. So first I'll build off what Lauren and Laakea just mentioned. Very much in agreement that, the ocean is an extension of the Pacific peoples. It's the interconnectedness that's very clear. It's instilled from a young age. It's not something that you have to teach because from very young, you're taught to respect the ocean, but there's also, and this is important to have Pacific Islanders in this field, there's this sense of reciprocity that is different. It's not extractive. It's not what's the maximum sustainable yield? How much can we catch so that we can come back next season and it doesn't collapse and we can catch some more? The mindset, the perspective of Pacific Islanders tends to be very different. We're all connected. The ocean is an extension of who we are. And so we respect the ocean and it looks after us. It's literally where our homes are. So having that perspective when we're talking about conservation, I think is really important. And for that reason, we need more Pacific Islanders in this space. It'll also help just folks like Lauren and I, because I, for example, when I came from Fiji to the States and I went my first day at Pew, I was very nervous, and thank goodness for Angelo, there was like, oh my gosh, there's one other Pacific Islander here, yay. And he was able to take me under his wing a little bit. But since then, Lauren, I don't know if this happens to you, but this happens to me often where folks are like, what is the Pacific perspective on this? And I'm like, let me show you a map. This is Fiji. This is the Pacific. Do you understand what you're asking me? And that's because we need more folks jumping up from that map. But this space is not always conducive to that. The conservation field, especially with fisheries, especially in a place like DC, can be competitive. And I realized that when I realized that pretty early on, but also when we were looking to get some consultancy on some of our work in the Pacific, a lot of the names that I got were expatriates from, these fancy universities that were not from the Pacific. And that really bothered me because our consultants everywhere else were from there, they were native. And so we commissioned this study to look into what we could do to increase the amount of Pacific Islanders in senior, in this case, it was fisheries roles, but a lot of the learnings were very much aligned for the conservation world and I think other fields too. And a few things popped up. Mentorship is important, but another thing was the communication style and how our upbringing and social norms are somewhat different. Very much taught to respect your elders and humility, and there's a quiet nobleness that comes with some of that upbringing that's not entirely appreciated in this field. I remember one of my first meetings where everyone's interrupting each other and the loudest voice usually dominates the conversation. And that's just not us. That's not how we operate. That's not how we were brought up. So I think it's important. It's not enough to have a space at the table. You have to very much make sure your voice is heard. And when you are there, look out for others around you, like having someone like Angelo try and pull me into some of these discussions, tell me yeah, you can go speak on that. And I was like, really? Even for this, I shared it with a few people, and Atris, I think, was on the call when I was like, this is awkward. I don't know how to do this, but I'm on a panel tomorrow if folks are interested, just because it's not in our nature. It's not in our nature to, self-promote and things like that. So that I feel is a disadvantage. And so for folks who make it into this field, we very much have to make space for others and make sure that they're heard. I think that's really important.
Can I touch on what Esther said, because she said my name? So there's a global movement right now to protect 30% of lands and oceans. It's called 30 by 30 in the United States. I'm seeing head nodding. In this country, it's called America the Beautiful Initiative, to attempt to protect 30% of our lands and 30% of our waters. And when you just think about where nature is, it's far away, right? It's distant. And so on land, it's Yellowstone. It's the big parks out west. But in the ocean, it's the US Pacific territories. And for the globe, it's the Pacific Islands. In the US, 29% of the US exclusive economic zone is just in the US Pacific territories. If you add in Hawaii, literally 50% of America's oceans is in the Pacific Ocean, the Pacific Islands. That's not counting California, that's not counting Alaska. The Pacific Ocean itself is larger than all land masses combined. So if we're going to talk about protecting these places, we have to make it work for the people that live there. And we have to understand the context. And I could give you a million examples of big NGOs or federal government agencies going out to our islands and just having amazing ideas, such a good idea. And then they get paid a ton of money. A project happens for 12 months, it gets implemented, and then that person leaves, the project ends, and it goes right on the shelf. And what's never happened is, like I said before, there are literally 6 Pacific Islanders working in federal ocean conservation for the NGOs right now. But it's half the ocean. Half of the people in ocean conservation should be from the Pacific Islands, because that's where the ocean is. And that's just not the reality. And for those of us being on the stage, you're working in the Senate, we're working for NGOs, we can communicate to these people who have power and have money of what's going to work, what's not going to work. I'm not going to do a great job of saying what's going on in Fiji, but there are very few Samoans at the table. The other thing is there's a great diversity of Pacific Islands. It's not only is it big, but it's diverse. There's a lot of similarities across Polynesia, but man, when you go to Micronesia, every island is going to be different. I think FSM alone has 18 languages.
It does, sure does, more than 4.
Yeah.
So Federated States of Micronesia consists of 4 states. So each state has different dialects. So it's,
The Mortlocks and all the islands around Chuk all have their
Right.
own languages.
but we're still binded together with culture and unity. And that's the beautiful thing about the Pacific Islander culture and the heritage. And one of the things that I also wanted to, sorry to interrupt, did you want?
Sorry,
me
no, I'm
to-
done.
One of the things that I also wanted to emphasize was the Pacific Ocean itself and the COFA countries, Republic of Marshall Islands, Republic of Palau. They have one of, I think they passed a bill with the Rock Islands, something about their marine sanctuary. But even with our large mass of ocean and airspace, it is a military strategic area for big countries. And by being an immigrant from a small island country that is rich in culture and natural resources, we still need a lot of work to be done. We still have a small representation here in the capital, but I hope our voices can be heard, and hopefully this can take us to future places to where we can collaborate with the Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. I think that's why we're together, because we're all from that same area or geographic location. So I think that's all the questions and we have for tonight.
All right, awesome. Well, first off, let's give a huge round of applause for our amazing panelists and moderators. All right, so very shortly before we move into the Q&A portion, we're going to kindly ask for all of our attendees here to take our audience survey. So there should be a QR code on your desk. If you would like a physical copy, please feel free to raise your hand, and then we'll be sure to hand out a copy of our survey as well. For our virtual attendees, I'll be dropping the link in the chat box very shortly. Your responses are really important to us as we work to improve our programming and also to support programs like these to keep on running. So after 5 minutes, we will move into our audience Q&A.
Uncle Saul, holla, holla, holla.
I do.
Yeah, he's a good buddy of mine. I was just in Monterey with him.
My tutu, my grandmother, used to wear that. We're photoing.
Should we
Okay, so thank you to everybody for filling out our survey. If you're still taking some time to fill it out, no worries. We will be collecting all of the surveys at the end.
Yeah.
So now we are moving into our Q&A portion. So for anyone in the audience here, if you have a question, please raise your hand and then we will be passing the mic over to you. All right, we have a question right in the middle.
Hello, thank you all for having this event.
Where am I looking?
My name's Kim. I'm a
Oh.
grad student. I'm Filipino American and I'm interested in sustainable development. I had a couple of questions, and the first one is in the wake of climate change and colonialism, capitalism, and now our migration. In your opinion, how would one sustain one's culture and traditions in this generation and for future generations? Is that possible, do you think? And my second question is that oftentimes, local communities who rely on the environment, especially, more poor communities, they're more vulnerable to climate change. And some of the things I've seen are like promotion of, eco businesses and trainings, like capacity building, quote unquote. And more recently, I've seen more advocacy around incorporating Indigenous knowledge in policymaking. And I was wondering, from your perspectives, how do you reconcile like sustaining livelihoods, like let's say people who depend on the forest or the ocean for their livelihoods? How do you reconcile those two, like sustaining livelihoods and conserving resources? Thank you.
I can try the first one first. How do we sustain our cultural identities? This is how I'm framing the question, your question in my brain. How do we not lose our culture? How do we not lose our identity in the globalization that is colonialism, capitalism, etc. I was raised in the tradition of hula, which is storytelling, through the Edith Kanaka-Ole Foundation. I was raised as a interpreter of our environment. Our traditional hula practices are environment based, it's cultural stewardship based, it's natural resources management based. And it all is tied in with our literature. So I think when I heard your question, I immediately thought of the storytelling that our culture and many Pacific Islander cultures are, storytelling is huge for us. And that's how we pass down the cultural knowledge. So I immediately thought of that, and that's how we sustained our cultural knowledge, was to sing about it, to chant about it, to dance about it, to sing, chant, and dance about it to each other, to our children, have our children do it, and I thought about that, and then I also thought about the natural phenomenon that happens today and that will continue to happen, and how we need to continue writing literature about that and continue not just looking back to old stories of like, oh, they wrote this one song about a particular volcanic eruption hundreds of years ago. We also have to look at the volcanic eruptions that are happening now and write the stories of how we're experiencing them now. So my thinking there is that we shouldn't think about our culture as a fossil, is that like we are still living it, we are experiencing it, and whatever we do is that the latest interpretation of our culture, a lot of, especially in Hawaii, we have because of colonialism, we had to revitalize a lot, and we have to look back to ancient texts a lot and history a lot. So there's a lot of well, back in the day they did it like this, you know, back in the day they said it like this, or in a book I read once of a journal from the 1800s, someone said they did it like this. But our culture is very context based and it's environment based, and I think it's also time based. So like whatever we have in this time, I think we interpret it and through our lens, through our processes, and then I think that's how we can not lose our identity. You know, we have to just interpret it what the world is now, and then kind of just continue with that process. I don't know if that last part made sense, so I'm gonna stop. Thanks.
If I could add,
Oh,
go ahead.
Yeah.
do you want to add or do you want to?
I was just gonna add on that bit.
Add on to.
Yeah. So like similarly in Fiji, we have what they call the meke. It's like our version kind of a hula,
Mhm.
and it is very much like environmental based. And you know, they have now Tawerilmal Ndakwanga. That is the story about Ndakwanga, the shark god. And I think how we tell those stories might change a little bit. I very much grew up where, you know, my grandmother would be sitting around twirling with my hair, or all the folks would be sitting around having kava. It's this traditional drink, and then you share stories. Folks don't do that as much. Everyone seems really busy these days, but whatever we can do to help share those stories, I think is important, because it helps continue to instill sort of that respect, reciprocity with the ocean. And one of the ways that we're actually doing this is Ray, my colleague, and I, we're doing a TED Ed, or we're working with the TED Ed folks on the story about Ndakwanga to try and get a little more Pacific stories out there. There's a bunch of myths and legend about the Greeks and all the Norse gods, and we're trying to infuse some Pacific Island legend into that, because a lot of those stories have very clear environmental messages that we can take home. So that's one bit. The other point I wanted to raise is right now, like in the last few years, I've seen this movement with a bunch of NGOs where they are trying to incorporate Indigenous knowledge. Some folks are doing a good job, some maybe a little bit slow. But Angelo is part of this too. I think he headed it up, was the Indigenous Working Group, where we're trying to figure out how we can bring Indigenous knowledge into our conservation space, and how we can make Indigenous communities kind of lead this work and be at the forefront. It's not just a consultation and then check that box and then you go and do your own thing, but having them lead that journey, and we take on kind of a supporting role when it comes to conservation. And so trying to flip how some of the NGOs work in that space, I think is going to be important. And then again, making space for Indigenous communities to come in and share their practices. An example in Fiji is what we call tambus for Ngolingolis, so fishing areas. This goes way back when, if there is a death in the community, in the village, or if and sometimes they'll just see if the coral reefs aren't doing too good, then we will have a tambu where you have a set area for a set time where folks aren't fishing. And this allows the coral reefs or whatever fishing area to kind of recuperate. And no, we didn't have our ancestors out there with transect lines and trying to record all of this. There was just this kind of innate knowledge that came with being Pacific peoples, with being, you know, an extension of the ocean. So those are a couple of ways I wanted to highlight.
I'll add too. So yes, storytelling is so important. I recently went to the island of Roja, or Luta, as we say in Chamorro, which is one of the islands north of Guam, part of the CNMI where Angelo is from. And I had the honor of like just sitting down with the mayor and an elder of the community there. And he was telling me so many awesome things about like how well the Chamorros knew the ocean. And it was things that I didn't even know. And, you know, he's, I don't know, maybe in his 70s, and he still has that knowledge. I don't know. How old is Saina Fadang? Do you know him? Tommy Mendiola, I don't know. He was like, just like telling me all these things. And he said, we knew way long before anyone that the Marianas Trench was the deepest place on earth because our ancestors called it the belly of the ocean. And they knew it was deep. How did they know? And so there's just people out there still who have this cultural knowledge. And so to keep our cultures alive, it's very important to tell the stories. But in the case of like migration, like where people are gonna eventually have to be forced to leave some of their homes because sea level rise, washing away islands, or fires or droughts, like all of the above, right? One important component of indigeneity is living with the land, living with the seasons, living with the other animals, living with the environment, the entire ecosystem, paying attention to the growth of the trees, how many animals are here, how they're all related. And that's how indigenous peoples come about, because they become a part of a place. So if we are ever forced to leave anywhere, find the people there who know that place and can teach you, who like would welcome you, but also it's important to, when you move somewhere, learn about the place, like respectfully. I lived in Vermont for 2 years and I learned like wild foraging done in a respectful way, not taking more than was needed. So like, you're not like just fishing for profit, like you're like taking berries for your day, right? Because the berry bush is for everyone. But we can, I think, keep some cultural wisdom in how we interact with the world, how we interact with each other and other species and our resources, because those are what sustain us, and our actions impact how we are able to keep that sustenance. And to get to your question about how can you reconcile, the need to utilize resources from the environment and conservation. When you think about like overfishing, that's done on a commercial industrial scale, like to survive. Like if you want to live in harmony with the environment and no like big capitalism and like preserving the environment, you are not going to be like chopping down forests. You're not going to be like fishing this whole area to the point where there's no fish. It's just, it doesn't compute. There are people though who feel like they have to exploit their land or their ocean resources for the sake of their local economies. And we need to figure out ways to help them shift their economies, also help the places that are completely reliant on imports from colonialization. How can they diversify their economy and reintegrate those land-based, ocean-based practices that sustained their ancestors, so they don't have to be reliant on like major industry and major exploitative and imports.
I just have like one tiny thing to add to all that discussion on migration. The diaspora for many of the American affiliated islands is bigger in the mainland than it is in the islands. So especially like in recent, there's more Chamorros like living in Idaho, in Washington and Oregon, Washington, DC, than there are actually living in Guam and Saipan. The thing about, these are issues that like all cultures are facing, of like, how do you maintain being Japanese when you're fifth generation in California? Are you still Japanese? For indigenous communities, because we're colonized, we also face that at home. So most of us, not only are we minorities in the lands that we travel to, but we're also minorities in the lands that we've known for thousands of years. So in addition to asking the question, how do I maintain my culture when I go to far lands? We also, like, the immediate question of like, how do we even maintain our culture in the lands that we inhabit now? And like I'm first generation who left. Like my dad went to school here, but went back. And then I was born there, and then I moved here. I think maybe permanently. I don't know. I own land back home, but and I know your same story. You know, you're first generation. But like my brother has kids. They've never been home. Will they ever go there? Like I don't know. And this is to a certain degree been like the story of America for 150 years. Something like 1 in 3 Americans identify as Irish, including myself. And there's like 150 Irish in the US, but only 15 million Irish in Ireland. And so like it's a great question. I don't know if there's any answers, but just wanted to bring that point about we're also minorities in our own home as well.
All right, so I think we have a few questions from some of our virtual attendees, which I will read out loud. So
Virtual. Where's the camera?
So
Yeah. Hi, virtual. I've been wondering this entire time.
yeah, so they're all in the Zoom meeting right now, and we have a couple of really great questions from our virtual audience. So the first is from Quay. She says, hello. First off, thank you so much to the panelists for sharing their wisdom and experiences with us. As a student who is studying environmental science and Asian American studies and is passionate about sustainability, it's so inspiring to see the change that's being enacted by AA and HPI leaders in this realm. Laakea, you touched on tourism's role in the exploitation of Hawaii. As the ongoing imperialism in Hawaii and many of the other Pacific islands is built on a fetishization of the beauty of the environment, how do you see environmental movements moving forward, pushing people to reconnect with the land, but straying away from this fetishism? And this can be a question for any of the panelists.
You said Hawaii.
She did say Hawaii. Hello, virtual. Thank you for the question. Yeah. Yup.
Yeah.
Yup. I think the issue, right, is and my friends are annoyed at me all the time, is capitalism and what people value and the differences between a capitalist value system versus and how it's at odds with the indigenous value system. Like we have been talking for however long we've been talking about how we all value the ocean and the environment. And so that's why that value system led to our work. And that is at direct odds to with the exploitation of tourism, right? Because the touristic, is that a word? It is now. The touristic value system is to exploit, to overfish and to make money, and to fetishize the land, the people, if you go to Hawaii, you can have the luau experience. And what's difficult too is sometimes those are the only jobs that Native Hawaiians can get. So there's this cycle of, well, I can't live in my own homeland. I'm a minority in my own homeland. And the only thing that can sustain my life in this capitalist society is if I go and be exploited every day, and I go and put on this show for these white people or for these foreigners who come into our land to see Hawaii, Hawaii, you know what I mean? So it's a vicious cycle. When I mentioned about working in the tourism industry, it was very unfulfilling as someone who from my background, it was a very unfulfilling. I had to cater to these foreigners who honestly treated me like crap, and very ignorant, not ethical tourism at all, like they did no research coming to the island first, and every time I maybe answered a question, they would negate my answer, I've had many experiences like that. So I don't remember the question, and that is my answer, and somebody else say
Sure.
something.
Can I
Oh,
Oh,
Can
yeah,
I
sure.
add on to that? I was hearing them talk and it really connected me to my culture. I think one of my island state of my country is the only one that still practices having a king and queen. And it's so powerful to know how culture can be so powerful because even the king and queen's power, they have so much more power than the president of our country because you have to go through the respected traditional leaders to get what you want, especially foreign people that come into Micronesia, try foreign investment board with oceans and different kind of NGOs. I think with having culture, that is very important that foreigners understand that being connected to the locals is important to keep that in order for you to have a final outcome to be productive with whatever your mission or your goal is. I thought about that and wanted to share how traditional leaders play a big major role in decision making.
I was just gonna add on the tourism bit because Fiji too is known for some tourism, and I was just there, spent the month of February back home, and I saw just how badly it was impacted by COVID because so much of our revenue comes from tourism. So everyone's like, "Oh, we need all the tourists back." Yes, but at the same time, a lot of those jobs are very low-paying jobs. And then you have also these like performances, there's these fire dances and walking on hot stones, and that always like really unsettling to me that why are we performing our cultures for these people's entertainment? It just grinds my teeth. But then people still say, well, we still need jobs because we've like now set up this system to make folks rely on this. And then everyone's like, oh, yes, tourism and the hotels, that brings work, that brings money. It brings low paying jobs. And a lot of the wealth is very much centralized at the top. And then in return, you're exploiting your environment. You know, many beautiful mangrove sites have become places that they've tried to turn into beaches. And these are important nursery grounds. They're important for carbon sequestration. They're important places for artisanal fishers to go and harvest. My favorite food is found in the mangrove swamps. It's called mud lobster or mana. Try it once in your lifetime. It'll blow your mind. So that's being stripped away so that we can have these beaches for these tourists, so that we can have these low-paying jobs. Like that just doesn't compute. We're robbing our future generation of these environmental resources just so that we can kind of get by. And so it's very much a broken system.
capitalism.
I think all Americans deserve access to nature. There's my wife over there. Hey, wife, I'm going to mention you, Eden. So I live in Washington, D.C. There have been times in my life where I would go jogging. Hasn't happened much in the last 2 years. But I've got a great place where I can go jogging. I've got a park right next to me. I play softball every Sunday with my friends, and there's a nice park. If I want to get like into nature, I'll go to Teddy Roosevelt Island. But we have a national park pass, the America the Beautiful Pass. And every other weekend we'll drive out and go to a national park and go hiking and learning about history. And so I'm a environmental advocate, but I also understand the history of Western environmentalism in the United States. And it was founded in genocide and white supremacy. And they didn't teach me that when I was learning about it in the 1990s. And I mostly learned about that as an adult. And so that just a couple of weeks ago, we were out in California. We went to John Muir Woods. John Muir, the great racist who inspired the environmental movement. But still, I stand beneath those trees, and I'm thankful that somebody protected them. And so the problem of the past, it's not that conservation is bad. It's that the process to do it has been bad and that too many people have been left out of it. And, you know, a big part of the America the Beautiful initiative from the Biden administration is this access to nature and making sure that the process matters, you know, give people voices in the development and the management of these protected areas. And like out in the Pacific, they're dealing with this right now with the expansion of the Pacific remote islands. And people have strong opinions depending on the level of power that they have in the decision making. So it was a great question for the person online. But I'm Catholic, right? So this phrase, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There is, even though a lot of conservation came from like a really bad place, I still find great joy to be in the water or, you know, in a grove of trees. And I think this movement just needs to do better and be honest with itself. And just you apologize and you move on.
All right, so before we close out the session, we have one more question from one of our virtual attendees, and to all of our in-person attendees here, if you have any questions, please hang tight. You'll be able to talk to our panelists afterwards, but we have a question from one of our virtual attendees, and they say, could panelists talk a bit about the impact of Asian settler colonialism in their homelands, especially one, seeing that Kanaka called for a tourism halt during this pandemic and land back, 2, Filipinos sometimes identifying as PI, and 3, Guam's majority of homes or lands are owned by non-Chamorro, but by Koreans, for example.
How many days do we have to answer this?
Good
Yeah.
question, virtual.
Can you repeat the 3 things? Was it 3 things?
Yes, so the first was 1,
Asian.
seeing that Kanaka called for a tourism halt during this pandemic and land back, 2, Filipinos sometimes identifying as PI, and 3, Guam's majority of homes or lands are owned by non-Chamorro, but by Koreans, for example.
Okay, so regarding the second point about Filipinos identifying as Pacific Islanders, okay, the AAPI, now AANHPI thing is so complicated anyways.
Yeah.
It's like imposed upon us by white people, and
Thank you.
Obama was like nice and put an and between Asian American Pacific Islander, right? Because they just said we're all the same thing, and we're not. We are like probably the most diverse cultural group ever, like on the census, but you know, as Pacific Islanders, we are a minority within a minority, right?
Filipinos invented lumpia. Call yourself whatever you want. Thank you for
I mean, like,
lumpia.
Yeah, Filipinos, like they're an island.
Yeah.
They're like near Asia. They're in the Pacific Ocean. Like, I am not gonna get mad at any Filipino saying they're Asian or Pacific Islander, but like to me, they're Filipino. Like
Half the
you
kids
know.
on Guam are half Chamorro, half Filipino anyways. So
Most of my friends growing up are
Yeah.
Filipino or Korean or, you know, yes, Chamorro, but like my friend group was like so wildly diverse. So it scares me when I'm in a room with a lot of white people. So I feel like really at home here. So it's the majority of land being owned by Koreans. I don't know if that's true. But what upsets me right now, as an adult, Chamorro woman, what upsets me stems back from, I mean, there's several things that upset me, but related to land. So not only does the military own about 28% of the land, and they are destroying the last of our pristine native limestone forest to build a live fire training range, and it will also limit access to one of our best fishing areas. And that land was supposed to go back to the native landowners a long time ago, but it never happened. But with the military buildup, that resulted in this live fire training range for the Marines to come back to Guam. The budget for military housing, like, was all of a sudden a very big deal. And because more military people were coming to Guam, all the landlords were raising rents to fit the military budget. So a 4-bedroom condo with private parking and a pool, which was $1,000 a month on Guam when in 2007 before the buildup. Like now it's like a 2-bedroom is at minimum $2,000. And that's because of the military's budget. So like when I went back to Guam, the last time I had a pretty mixed group of friends. I'm a very social person, so I have like several circles that I hang out with. And this one circle is a lot of expats, military, stateside biologists who like moved to Guam. And most of my friends who weren't from Guam bought homes on Guam, but my friends who are from Guam like cannot afford to buy a home on Guam. So I don't know if Koreans own more property or more land than Chamorros. I know that some people are selling off their land for development, so maybe it's related to hotels. But yeah, there's not a great economy on Guam. So there's some people who are like, I have this land, I can make $1 million off of it, and I'm going to do that. And they feel like they should have the right to do that because we're pretty disadvantaged. So yeah, it breaks my heart that like some person in the military could like come to Guam and have a better shot at buying a home. And you know what? They leave like a year or two later, and then they rent it out to another military person. So the military is just like keeping all this revenue to themselves, and it's like hurting like local communities. There's the first part of the question, which I didn't answer, but it's okay, right? Okay.
Does anyone else want to add to that piece? Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you for letting me rant.
That's a Guam question. Guam girl answer it.
What?
More like forced out of paradise.
Yeah.
Did you guys watch American Idol?
Uh,
E.M. Tongi, when he said, why did you leave paradise? Why did you leave Hawaii? Forced out of paradise. Because the housing in Hawaii and Guam is rising. And yeah, migration is real for Pacific Islander because of the outrageous cost of living.
Did you want to add to that?
No.
I have something to add. It's not related to the question. It's just two somewhat positive points that I thought worth highlighting because I know we've poured our hearts out here, and I don't want us walking away a little bit sad on tourism and on the Pacific Island representation. On the tourism bit, one thing I am happy to see is there is a movement towards ecotourism, and I know everyone defines that differently. I have folks who run Turtle Island that do a very good job of incorporating Indigenous knowledge, providing fair jobs, and also doing a lot of marine conservation for turtles specifically, and educating their tourists. So it, to me, provides a beacon of hope that you can maybe sometimes strike that balance. That's one bit. And then the other one is talk about Pacific Island representation and its importance. For me, coming from a fisheries lens, the Western Central Pacific Ocean is home to almost $20 billion tuna industry. So who should be looking after the tuna in the Pacific Ocean? Maybe the Pacific Islanders. And so it's good to see a group. In fact, when we were talking about this, Angelo mentioned them. And so I was like, yeah, I definitely want to talk about the parties to the Nauru Agreement, where you got a bunch of Pacific Island countries who've gotten together and they've been able to amplify their voices and really steer change and kind of lead some of the management and conservation measures for fisheries in the region. And so that, again, is just another beacon of light I want to throw out there.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you so much to our panelists and our attendees for their questions. I will hand it over to Colby to close us out.
Big round of applause for the panel. Meeyoung, Laakea, Angelo, Lauren, Esther, thank you so much. Thank you for sharing your cultural wisdom. Thank you for sharing your time with us, your stories. Thank you for the mentorship. Thank you for your continued advocacy. Angelo, you said 6 people working on these issues. Hopefully this inspires more. Let's grow that population. I think all of us, I think one of the points is like, we have a lot of work to do in providing a platform and being supporters and being allies of this. I think that's something Paul is still working on. But I hope those who attended today feel inspired. I hope you stay connected with our panelists. We'd love to stay connected with you. I have some board positions opening up. I'd love to chat. But folks, if you had a good time tonight, if you enjoyed the knowledge that was shared today, we have more coming at you. Our next session is going to be on July 12th. We're going to take a little bit of a break. We'll be back here at the AT&T Forum. I believe the next session is AA and NH and PI representation in media and its intersection with public service. We'll have another great panel for you then, talking about media as a tool for empowerment and the importance of representation. I want to thank again our sponsors, Moapia. Thank you to AT&T again, to Comcast, to Bonafide. Thank you to all for tuning in online. We really appreciate it. Thank you for your questions. Thank you to this very smart audience. We're going to close the night with just some mingling, some networking. Please take food home with you. And panel would love to capture a picture of you together before you take off. So thank you, everybody.
We'll do the picture over in the corner.